Welcome back to the Intelligent Teams podcast, where we bring the sciences of mind into dialogue with practical wisdom to help you build high-performing, intelligent teams. I'm your host, Daniel Susser. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy being a subscriber to the Intelligent Team Substack. To receive a free weekly article or podcast with explorations of teams and cognitive science, complete with tools and tips, go to intelligentteams.substack.com and click subscribe. This week's guest is philosopher, founder, and host of the Love and Philosophy podcast, and poet, Andrea Hiott. And I'm delighted to welcome Andrea to the show.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
Hi, thanks for coming on. What do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a little thrown off because you called me a poet, and I'm not really a poet. I did write poetry in New York when I was young, and I was around some really great poets, so I don't write poetry now so much. But I love poetry. I'm working in philosophy, and I'm working on a philosophy of mind, as ambitious as that sounds. But I have been doing it for a long time, and I went back and studied neuroscience towards that. So I would say I'm working on trying to understand the world and what cognition kind of is in that world in a way that's maybe somehow helpful in everyday life. I'm trying to bridge these different scales between my own life, but just, the life that I see around me in terms of what philosophy is and philosophy as a way of life and how that relates to, these other issues in science that I care a lot about, such as those in neuroscience, technology, and so on.
And so what drew you to mind in particular?
Well, I think these things develop through our life, right? I mean, it's, at least for me, the continuity of what I've been interested in has been there since as long as I can remember. I mean, I remember being a little kid and writing kind of things in my notebooks. I was always writing. I was always doing that thing where you sort of look at what your own thoughts are and think about them, before I really understood what that was. And I just find it kind of magical. And for me, it draws me in to try to understand, why am I feeling this way? And how am I even aware? How am I here? I mean, that's the more poetic side of just the sort of spectacular realization that you can become aware of yourself in the world and of other people and of animals. And I remember all of that as a kid, being very interested in just reading a lot of novels, poetry, reading a lot of trying to understand people's lives, science. And then I thought I would go into law, actually, in university. I'm not really sure why. Maybe just it was more expected of me. And I took a philosophy class, my first philosophy class. And that it's one of those things, right? I think we all have them, where suddenly the room becomes a little bit brighter and everything opens up. It feels like that. And you just kind of know, okay, something just opened and I can't close that door. Then I went down the path of studying philosophy. And yeah. That opened up into trying to understand more the brain, because you get into ideas of philosophy of mind, and then you start thinking, well, there's this mind-body thing. Is that real? Like, why do we talk about them as if they're separate? And you want to understand the so-called other side, which seems like studying the brain and neuroscience. So that's how I ended up doing that as well. Mostly, I think I just want to know everything.
And this just seemed like the sensible place to start.
Right. Yeah.
Do you remember what the topic was in that class where it felt like something opened that couldn't be closed and the room became brighter?
Yes, it was a philosophy of mind question. It was actually, the teacher taught it in a really interesting way, though, that somehow in that one class I first heard of Hegel, who I ended up writing my first thesis on, of Hegel and this idea of the dialectic or whatever, and also of Merleau-Ponty. So this was a great professor who brought those two into a relation. Of course, there's the phenomenology, that word, but most people wouldn't put those two people together. And there was something about this word, phenomenology, and phenomenology of spirit, which was the Hegelian book, but then the Merleau-Ponty idea of embodiment and the body. So I think what opened was kind of what I was already starting to express, that, wow, okay, there's mind, which I know through my experience of coming into awareness, but I'd never really thought that much about that connection to my embodiment, and that itself could be a subject of study. I just hadn't thought of it in those terms. And so there was something about that class. I remember where I was sitting and everything, and I don't remember exactly how it was phrased, but it was just that kind of rolling out of the notion that, first of all, I'm an embodied thinker. That's cool. Like, what does that mean? And phenomenology feeling like a kind of a sexy, sensual kind of word that somehow already for me felt like it connected body and mind. And then thinking, wow, this guy's a philosopher and he's made his whole life and career on thinking about this. That's very cool, right? It was like all of that at once that sort of hit me. And then going back and looking at law books just wasn't quite the same.
I think that's maybe the first time I've heard sexy and sensual used to describe a philosophy class. But
I think philosophy is very much those things, and I don't mean them in a like just sort of trying to be whatever, a little bit rude or something. I really mean it like it feels to me like that. It feels to me like what could be more exciting and connective than trying to understand how we are in this world and how we become present to ourselves and to one another. It was that moment where it just felt like, what else would I want to know? And also you're at that age where you're coming into your own awareness of yourself as a subject. I guess I was 20. I don't know how old I was, but so those things feel even more potent at that age because you really are, in a way, waking up to yourself as an individual with a self that maybe you have some agency over. Maybe not. It can also feel like you don't at that age, so...
Yeah, well, I guess that's what makes it the sort of the boundary where you're discovering you're going from like one state and being transformed through like this study or through these experiences into unknown,
exactly,
infinitely interesting sort of thing.
Transformation, that's a good word. That's probably a summary of how it felt.
I'm opening up lots of tabs in my mind as we go along, so I'm going to try and close some of them so that it's like not the one at the end. But phenomenology, for someone that hasn't heard of phenomenology, for someone that hasn't heard of Hegel, for someone that hasn't heard of Merleau-Ponty, what are those things?
Yeah, sorry, a bunch of big words, but I think it's really just experience. And of course, philosophers can argue forever about what these words mean, but for me, in the most common way, it's just this phenomenology is taking experience seriously, and it's taking the subjective point of view seriously, but in a way that could be studied and thought about, considered. And I mentioned Merleau-Ponty, who's a French philosopher, kind of connected to the existentialists, I guess. He was with Sartre and Beauvoir. But they had found these German philosophers, Husserl and Heidegger. And Husserl is really the person who started using this term phenomenology as almost like a discipline or a kind of philosophy. Really what he was trying to do was bring subjectivity into science, because in science we had gotten to a point, or still sort of there, where we think we're looking for things that are objective, and that somehow has nothing to do with our own personal experience. But of course, science starts with humans having personal experience. And so we build all these wonderful technologies and we find all these ways of studying the world, which are very important, and we call them objective, but we never really can get away from the fact that we're each in a subjective position, a different position. And he was sort of saying, hey, we need to take this seriously in our science. It doesn't mean we say objective is bad, but let's think about this again. So I guess that's more like a general idea of the phenomenology. Wasn't just, when I was sitting in that class, it wasn't like, oh, here's philosophy and it's a discipline and it's objective and it's sitting on the shelf and you just learn what's there. It felt interactive. It felt, and that's where that embodiment comes in, which is a big part of Merleau-Ponty, the guy that I mentioned, his work, and also phenomenology in general and the way it became a lot of what we think of now as 4E kind of cognition, embodied, inactive, ecological, whatever you want to put for the E's, embedded. But really it's about taking the subjective experience seriously, that sensuality, but doing it in a way that's also very aware of how much we learn from a scientific method, so to speak. Yeah, and then Hegel, I don't know, I can't explain Hegel. Hegel's a German philosopher he was born in the late 1700s. And if you've heard of Hegel, you probably have heard of dialectic, which is this thesis, antithesis, synthesis movement. And that's a kind of generalization of Hegel. But he wrote a book called Phenomenology of Spirit. And it's actually one of the first explorations of what is self-consciousness, which relates to all this other stuff I've been talking about. How do we come into awareness of ourselves as a subject? And that process it's a kind of movement of dialectic. It's like what I was describing, where you realize you're a self and you look at yourself and that changes yourself. This process is basically what Hegel is trying to express in his philosophy. So all that, there's a thread there of what my interest was that maybe you can start to get the feeling of.
Yeah. So if I understand it right, in your philosophy class, there'll be different schools of philosophy. There'll be ontology, like what's the nature of reality, or epistemology, which is like how can I know stuff, like what can I learn about the world, or ethics or political philosophy, and how do we organize power. And then phenomenology would be like another book or another like subject within that, and it's about studying subjective experience, right? Like what is the redness of red, or like where does red, when I experience something as red, or if I remember something as red, like where does that happen? Is that like a phenomenological question?
That's definitely a big question in philosophy of mind and in terms of this mind-body problem and so on. And I would say you can break philosophy down into the study of ontologies or empiricism or epistemology. There's a lot of words you could use to break it all down into different paths, analytic, continental. But I tend to try to be very messy with that because I don't like those boundaries at all. And I don't think that phenomenology is about just one particular kind of little world. I think it's an approach to all of those things you just said. They all blur and come together. And I wouldn't say like I'm a phenomenologist and so therefore there are these 4 rules of being a phenomenologist that you then must do. I am not that kind of a philosopher. There are people who are those kinds of philosophers and they're wonderful, but that's not how my creativity and motivation work. So for me, I don't think of it like that. I think of it more as all of those words maybe are great for categorizing different kind of approaches depending on what your problem is. Do you want to know something about knowledge? Then maybe you're going to look at epistemology of a certain tradition. But what do you really mean by knowledge? Because again, if you're thinking of it as an embodied kind of knowledge, you're going to look to different places. So yeah, it's a word that's gotten attached to a certain kind of philosopher who's more interested in taking subjectivity seriously and thinking about these problems that are raised in ontological problems, epistemological, metaphysical, from a particular position or perspective. But the other ones are wonderful too, and they all influence one another.
Yeah, I love that sort of seeing these things, seeing phenomenology or seeing them as threads that sort of will dialogue with or overlap with each other, or I don't know why the word like densities came up for me. Like,
that's interesting. What do you mean by that? That's a good word. Densities, Did you say?
Yeah, I don't know what I mean by that, but I think I was reading about what was I was reading this weekend, like Carl Friston and sort of density probabilities and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if I understood the maths enough for it, but like my own little brain did its own little exploration of it, which may or may not be what was intended in the paper. But the idea that there's sort of density distributions and some things are more dense and clustered in one place than they are in another, but there being like no fundamental difference between like the more densely clustered bits and the less densely clustered bits. If I throw sand on the floor, there'll be like little clumps and there'll be sort of like sparse bits and there'll be empty bits, and they're all part of the same sort of existence. So I think with the philosophy and with the phenomenology, I was thinking maybe like there's like densities or clusters of like ideas or people or thoughts or approaches that would sort of coalesce around something referring to phenomenology, but that doesn't mean that they're like separate and distinct from
I love that. I think that's true, and it's one reason I didn't just go along with the categories, because a lot of what I try to do in the work is think of how these things do clump together, as you said, or do align differently according to where our position is, right? So that's a complex system kind of way of thinking, or network. What you were describing too, or even if we want to look at Bayesian statistics or certain kind of manifolds, for graphing it, and there's a way in which, from certain positions, certain things are going to be more or less relevant. And I guess I was sort of applying that to these philosophical approaches in a way too, which isn't to say that they aren't different and distinct and that they don't do better jobs in different places. However, I can't personally separate them as if they're not dealing with the same overall questions, because ultimately I think a lot of them are, even if they use different language maybe to express those questions and answers. But I like what you said. That's really, visually, I'm always trying to figure out ways to think about something like that. And densities is a good way to think about it. Layering. Somehow, if you can think of it like three-dimensional in terms of if you're moving through a certain landscape, trying to answer a certain problem, if you think of it as walking through a landscape, then from that point of view, that landscape's going to look different than from another point of view. And you can think of that as what you described as densities, I guess, of what affordances are there for you as you move. And philosophy is like that too.
Yeah, and or maybe like different different lenses or different hats or something is another. Maybe you can wear multiple hats, or you could wear one hat on your head.
Yeah, well, we all do that in everyday life, don't we? When you are walking your dog on the street and a certain challenge presents itself, you're not going to be looking for something in Merleau-Ponty, probably. You know, you're not, like, it's just when we're in different state spaces or phase spaces, or when we're in different situations, then different things are at hand, different affordances present themselves. And I don't think knowledge spaces, if you want to think of it like that, are different. I think when we're doing the hard work of trying to solve some sort of scientific or philosophical problem, we're coming into it the way we would a landscape, and there are going to be certain orientations that make sense in that situation that wouldn't necessarily make sense in another situation. It just can be very hard to hold all of that. It's almost easier to say, I'm an epistemologist, or I'm an idealist, or I'm a monist, or because then you can feel like the landscape is a little easier to explore rather than just everything being an option. So,
yeah,
but I don't.
And it's also, and it's like, on the one hand, there's like everything being an option, and I wear no hats, and there's no densities, and everything's available to me. And on the other hand, is like I must wear only this hat, or this is the only way I could lend, or I have to. I really constrain myself to this sort of acceptable set of beliefs, and there's somewhere between the two. And I was thinking, this sort of relates back to that first remark of like calling you a poet, and the connection there being like from listening to your podcast and reading your writings and things like that. And your podcast is called like Love and Philosophy, Beyond Dichotomy. There being an expectation maybe that these things would be dichotomous to each other. And maybe there'd be an expectation that like neuroscience and poetry, or philosophy, phenomenology and being a poet are sort of also in opposition to each other. But your work sort of embodies this way of them dialoguing with each other and understanding the science and the philosophy better through bringing in a poetic approach, and probably vice versa.
Yeah, no, you picked up on the right thing. I mean, for those who don't know, podcast is Love and Philosophy. It started as a research channel for a lot of work I'm doing because I was having a lot of interesting conversations, and someone said you should put them online, and then I think it's also helpful when you're having conversations for the person you're having it with, because then they can share this with a broader audience. So I started doing that. But the point is, it was all around a kind of research theme, which is what you were just expressing in a sense. It's trying to, beyond dichotomy is one way I say it, or holding the paradox, or these ways of, we talked about mind-body. That's in philosophy a big so-called dichotomy. We often think of mind as somehow something other than the body, or mental and physical as dichotomous. And you see that in all of life. I think whatever we're doing in life, we often are trying to put things in certain boxes or categories. Even in what you were talking about earlier, I think in our daily life where we get put into boxes. It happens in academia. If you choose this particular philosophy that you're going to be part of and write papers on, then you kind of become, you have to be in that little box. But it happens in daily life with everything, with our choices. We become known for this or this group that we're part of. And I guess what I am trying to do is understand how that can be fine. Like we're obviously part of groups. There obviously is mental and physical, mind and body, but these aren't separated. These are part of a common process. So how can we explore the space that's the patterns that connect those? What's in common? And philosophically, this opens up a lot of interesting space, but I also try to do it in a sort of daily, everyday way, not only with philosophy that you need to read 5 books to understand the terms within, but more, you've brought up poetry a few times, but these other things that inspire us and that move us through life and that we learn from. For me, those are very important parts of knowledge. And that's why I think of philosophy as a way of life, or that's a Pierre Hadot kind of saying, or philosophy for me is a living approach and orientation. And that channel and the conversations and this stance that you express very well that I'm trying to take is about how do we open the space, but still, of course, have distinctions and things that we care about and that we fight for and that are meaningful. Why does that have to feel like it's an either or choice? Why can't it be a both and choice? So a lot of these kind of explorations are about science or math or philosophy that's already exploring that, because a lot of people are trying to do that, trying to explore what it would mean to go beyond division and still have difference. Yeah.
So I was thinking some of the parts of your interviews with your guests that I enjoy the most is when you say to them, well, this is love and philosophy, right? So like, how has love shown up for you in the work that you do? And then you get people who, at least from my sort of experience of them, is through their work or their books or their contributions to their knowledge field. And you ask them about love and they always have a really good answer, which is like, well, obviously this thing shows up for me as love. Otherwise I wouldn't have dedicated, like 50 years to studying it and things like that.
Yeah, and usually that comes at the end because we sort of get into that space through talking about it. It can be hard as a scientist to talk about words like that, or a business person, or because they can seem too sentimental, or they can seem attached to things that you don't necessarily mean by the work you're doing. So usually I try to get into that space of what they really care about, because I don't think that love is an easy word, but I do think it's a part of our life and our work. At least we kind of hope for it to be, even if it's the reason we're doing it, even if we have to do the work because we love our family and we want to take care of them, or we love our dog and we want to take care of our dog. I mean, there's usually a thread, a current, a motivation of love in it, or some way in which we're looking for that, maybe too. So I find it delicate, and I find it very sort of meaningful to think about that word with people who are so scientifically oriented or philosophically oriented, or frankly even with the poets and the writers too, because really getting to that space can feel like it's oppositional to being a public person, right? It's hard to hold an intimate space and a public space together, I think, in a way that's authentic. So, but that's definitely part of that whole orientation, and also what I was trying to explain about why I think philosophy matters. I mean, love is in philosophy, right? That's part of the root of the word, so love of knowledge.
Sophia. Yeah, and I was like, if I think about the work I do, like I tend to work with technical teams who are doing something usually interesting, like writing software or building a product or something like that. And the idea, if I think about, I don't know, I want to say, like, especially as like a British person, the idea of saying like, where does like love feature in our work? It brings up a fear, like maybe they're not going to think I'm serious about what I do, or maybe they're going to think that I'm intruding into their inner world in some way that is not appropriate for the workplace or something like that, or I might fear
Isn't that
of
interesting?
triggering.
Yeah. I find it very interesting that we all feel that way. I mean, I feel that way too, right? I can feel that way too if you start asking me in a certain way, because it is it's hard to talk about those kind of things without showing who you are, and that's hard, I think. Or you end up talking about them in a way that's surface and, not really giving anything. I think there's a very interesting discomfort in there.
And like, I think about the people I've worked with over my career, and like they clearly like love their craft, or they love what they're doing, or they love elements, or even if they're angry and frustrated, it's because they love the work they want to be doing and they don't get to do that here, or something like that. So it's such a provocative angle to take on it. It's such a provocative question, but it's also so deeply woven that like makes me wonder, like, why isn't this the norm to be talking about this, or why isn't it? It's so obvious that it shows up for us.
Well, also maybe because it is so meaningful. We don't want to, because people, we do use that word. Sometimes I notice how often maybe you want to write that word, love, and you don't mean it in the way we're talking about it now. So there are these we don't want to generalize it or lessen it either. I think that's also part of what sometimes we worry about. But I think you're right. When I played sports in school, and when I remember the states of flow where you're really doing something together as a team, and by the way, that is also true in work. When you're having a good work flow or relationship, there's something there that I wouldn't say is disconnected from love, but it doesn't mean the kind of romantic love of, Valentine's Day or something, but it's that current that makes us feel alive and connected with one another and more than ourselves, and to want to be more than ourselves. Yeah. Like to want to be part of this, and for this to be a gift to everyone involved. I mean, those kinds of things are hard to talk about because it can sound too sweet or it can sound just uncomfortable. But when you're in those moments, actually, they're not sweet moments. They're very alive, not necessarily aggressive, but they're very dynamic, I guess is the word. Yeah.
Yeah, like, because they're moments of human connection is what I'm thinking about. Like when I meet someone at work in their humanness, or they meet me, and even if we're talking about something difficult, like a performance thing or something like that, or, giving feedback is something where like this topic comes up for me a lot, which is like when I'm giving feedback to this person, like, is it coming from a place of love? Again, not like eros, hopefully, in my workplaces, but, do I want to be connected to them as a human and see them as valuable in and of themselves, and like give something of myself in doing that and show some vulnerability? Like, yeah, love is definitely the word that would describe that. But that feels like it would be, like, I don't know, too... Yeah, I still can't get my finger on like why. Maybe it's because it is so precious and we have compartmentalized and we've made a dichotomy between like work and life. Like even something you said earlier, like the public persona that I show up with versus my private persona. Mm-hmm. And we do these things to protect ourselves, and it's normal and that kind of thing. But there are times where it would serve us more to be like, if I, as the manager of this team, or as a leader here, or as someone's manager or mentor or something like that, what would be the most like loving stance I could take towards this person or this team or this project or something like that?
Yeah,
and maybe that would just like open up.
I think
something.
That's a really good point, and not why we don't always need to say the word. We don't always need to bring up the word. But it can be helpful to have it, understand what we mean by it, and what it means when we're acting out of that space in our work, and not in a sentimental way, not in a needy way, definitely not in a kind of carnal way or some way like Valentine's card way, but definitely more in this, whatever it is that's greater than us, but that is us, that's connecting us to our work, to what we are doing at that time. There's a weird kind of presence that you can cultivate, I guess, with a lot of other different kinds of words. And I think a lot of our philosophy and science is trying to figure out what that is, We call it all kinds of things. I've used the word flow already a few times, and we were talking about aligning, and all these things are very connected. I'm not sure there's one thing that we can call love that like sets aside from that. For me, it's all very much connected. It's just when I bring in that word, or when I think about that word, then it does become that it's something you care continues, Yeah.
There's also something in, like, a lot of people in my world are interested in like complexity and emergence and interactions and stuff like that. And I'm wondering like what that's another one of those like cognates for love, is that when you talk about like, well, we're all like entangled in this thing, man, and like it's all about the interactions and the dynamism, and we're not like, just single unitary creatures all floating around in isolation from each other. We are deeply connected. They are describing something that is a love-like concept, or something that maps onto this greater thing that we are all part of, that we all care about, that we all contribute to and contributes to us. Like that, it becomes quite like religious quite quickly, or it feels, I hear it used as... There's something I've noticed is that the cognitive scientists, or the people that I talk to that are interested in cognitive science, tend to have somewhat of a more like religiously compatible orientation towards the world. Like I've interviewed a couple of people that are like, oh yeah, well, I'm a Catholic, like not because I just have to believe it, but because like that's my mythology that I use to understand the complex dynamism between me and the world, and like that's how love like flows to me through all that stuff, and it's completely coherent with religious worldview. And when we're talking about that, then we're talking about like the same, I don't know, Taoism meets Jesus meets complexity, complex adaptive systems, meets agile, meets software, meets philosophy, all in this connectedness thing that we're trying to make sense of.
I love that. And I think that it's that motivating force. I mean, you asked me what was my moment in philosophy, and I sort of described it. And that same feeling I've had in nature. I mean, you mentioned complexity or this kind of fractal thinking, or when you start to see patterns and you realize you're part of the pattern, or you cultivate a certain kind of presence that's also living and dynamic. A lot of the things you named, I think, are ways that we do that. And to the dichotomy thing, we need some organization too, right? We don't, to just kind of let go into the fractalness or the chaos or the flow is also not sustainable. So there's something about what you might be calling the religious, I think, that gives us something like a rhythm or a pattern or a habit that we know will continue and that can help us get back into that state. You know, we have rituals, or we have, I mean, a lot of what religion is having a moment and a time to come together in a certain kind of energy together. You know, just making the time for that in your week. It's amazing what that can change, whether you're meditating, whether it's Taoism, whether it's reading a text, whether it's prayer, whether it's church, whatever. Some of it's just that shared pattern of making space to let that, to be with other people who are going to be in that space, or to engage in some kind of a pattern or rhythm or prayer or ritual that will allow you to notice that space. So I think you're right. I think that gives people a lot of strength. And when you have, it doesn't have to be religious. We're using the word religious in different ways, but if you have a meditation practice or an exercise practice or some kind of journaling, or I don't know, there's a lot of ways to get in touch with it. I think it does provide something for you in your work because you have this kind of steadiness, this reservoir that you can go back to and add to, that when things get very difficult or challenging, you have that kind of, that rhythm to help you get through or to come back into it. So I guess a lot of successful people have something like that, even if it's running, you know, for an hour in the morning or something. There's usually some kind of structure so that you can explore and go into all these kind of crazy ideas that we've been talking about in terms of complexity or philosophy or science.
I also wonder, like, how much people's work plays the role of a religion for them. And I mean that, like, totally could be in a great way, could be in an awful way, right? Like, I know when I'm Jewish, and for me, like, religion is something that is, like, alive and vibrant and, like, net good, and something I, like, lean a bit towards at the times where it suits me. Sorry, mum. But for a lot of people, it's like a loaded term, or it comes with a lot of baggage of, I don't know, coercion or things like that. And that's why I appreciate what you're saying about whether it's like an exercise practice or something that connects you with yourself, with others, with ritual, with structure, and something that, like, you've roughly, like, chosen and want to be involved in. And that totally happens in the workplace with you've got, like, a bunch of people, like, united by common weird language and, like, subculture, with rituals, some of which are, like, rational and some of which are totally irrational, and we do them anyway, and like a place and sort of people and hierarchies and prophets and all this kind of stuff, prophets, PH and F. And it sort of plays that role of, like, an anchoring, orienting way of making sense of the world. It just happens that it's one that I show up to from 9 till 5. But maybe that's where, like, why people ask each other, like, what they do. Because it's kind of like saying, like, I don't know, what religion are you? Or, like, where are you from?
Yeah, or like it's almost like, what's the music you hear, or what patterns are you used to, and do our patterns connect? You know, you want to find something, some kind of common wavelength. I mean, yeah, that's kind of complicated though, isn't it? Because you don't want, I think what you said is true, and our work provides a structure. And of course, like, in the best scenario, your work and your life and your love and your connection to higher, whatever powers, if you believe in those, or whatever that is for you, all of that's continuous in a sense. So you can maybe kind of live your life most of the time from a similar place in terms of connecting that. But it can also get out of hand too, where we think we have to define ourselves by one or the other of those things in a way that's against something else, for example, or in a way that is just about, I don't know, I guess with the workplace, it's just that you can become so focused on making sure that you maintain your position or something, that it's not necessarily that you're connected to that flow anymore, such that so much as you need to stay, you're worried or you're in fear or something. So I don't know how you see where those overlap or don't overlap, or how you maintain a balance between that. Because some of what you just described sounds like overworking. On the other hand, it sounds like the most healthy kind of work environment. And those can be the same sometimes too. So I don't know. Yeah.
Or like sometimes the people who, just the flip side of it is the people who have a lot of expectation of like how much of their, I don't know, most meaningful moments will be in the workplace. They're a nightmare to work with, because they don't just like care about the thing or the issue at hand. They care about like what that means to them, for them to like the project to not go the way that they want or something like that. I know that like when I've worked in the charity sector, like you get like martyrs who've been there for years and years and are like, I could have done so, I could be earning the big bucks in the bank, and instead I'm here caring about the thing and being a nightmare to work with. And like that's not a healthy pattern either. So like that's not necessarily a good thing, I guess. Or like if I really care about the company and I think it's brilliant and I do really feel like I belong here, well that's fine, but then like the company might get sold or merge with someone else, and then like that opens you up for that being an existential crisis. And I don't know if any of one of these modes is like better or worse. There may be sort of energy minima or something like that. Like if what I need in my life right now is like an anchoring philosophy and a group of people to hang out with, and that's really important, and then like I'll join a company that like suits that for me, and I'll throw myself in maybe, and that can sort of work until it stops working and the company gets sold or I change or it changes, and then I need to like find another low energy state to rest in.
That's interesting what you say about expectation. I think that word is actually a good word, because what you expect of yourself or what your team expects from you or what your boss expects from you, those are all different spaces to be in. Some of them you have agency over and some not. And also when you were talking, I was thinking about the relationship between how you think of yourself as an individual and how you think of yourself as part of the community. And that relates a lot to a lot of philosophical things I think about relative to some of those themes we brought up with subject and object and so on, is how can we are in one position and we are one embodied being, and it's unique in space and time. But a lot of what art and poetry and work and religion do is help us try to understand what the world is like from another position and share our positions with one another, open up those channels so that we increase what's possible for all of us. So that's interesting in the workspace too, to how to negotiate, like you said, wanting to be important, because we all want to be important parts of the team. And yet at the same time, how to have a healthy understanding of what you are as an individual relative to that group, and how much you do or do not need to have your actions seen and praised. And, I think those can be very hard things to negotiate on all those levels. As an individual, we get sometimes easily caught up in wanting to be the most important team member, or wanting to show what we have, all these skills and we want to show them. And then also, just like I said, if you have a boss that's demanding certain kind of performance, that's a different kind of stress. So yeah, I guess it's like a bigger question of how do we create these ecosystems that are aware of all those different things and allow people to look at them in that subjective way I was talking about, to notice that these are pressures and talk about them and have a healthy way of dealing with that and structuring it.
Yeah, and there's also like the way that management will think about what the organization is made up of or something like that is also important, because if management says, right, we're going to manage individuals' performances, we're going to give people individual bonuses based on individual performance, then what you're saying is like we will put a constraint in that system that means that individuals will do what is going to be most likely to maximize their bonus. And that might be like at the expense of achieving the organizational goal, right? I'd be happy to screw you over, teammate, if it means I can get my bonus. If you get yours, like, what do I care as long as I can get mine? Whereas if you say, the functional unit of this organization is like a team, so the team gets a bonus and no one gets a bonus unless the team achieves their objective or works well together, then you'll put a different kind of constraint that can influence behavior in all sorts of different ways. There's so much that's like unconsciously threaded through our organizations, from the way that we hire to job profiles, all this kind of stuff that's like the nuts and bolts of how we do work, that assumes that the interesting part of an organization is the individual, and lots of them being in the same building, as opposed to like building like really well-oiled and aligned teams. And you mentioned like subject object. It's like, what would it look like for the subject to be the team and the object to be like the world outside the team or the problem? Instead, what we do is we say the subject is each individual worker and the object is like everything outside of them. But that maybe gets the level of analysis wrong or something like that.
Or it just tries to choose one of them. I mean, back to this holding the paradox and thing, is that both of those are true. There's the subject, me, and the object, my workplace, but there's also the subject of the small team that I work on in or as part of, and whatever the larger group is, of our discipline or team or whatever this work is. But I wonder if you've found ways to hold that paradox, or if you've seen ways to structure that such that individuals are able to be individuals, and to also understand that at the very same time, they're also part of larger groups which are going to be seen and evaluated as an individual. Is that something that's hard to express, hold, like be part of? Because I know you're sort of working with Agile, and I don't know a whole lot about that, but I feel like we talked about structure, and I feel like there's some really good structures there that's maybe helping that process or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so delighted to talk about Agile.
I don't know anything much about it, so.
Yeah, so Agile is a set of philosophies and structures and frameworks about making teams really high performing and work well together, and seeing teams often as the unit of analysis that you want to start with. So
is it still kind of an either or thing, or is it?
Well, it's in order for the team to be the interesting thing. You need to bring in the individuals with their skills and roles, and then you need to like handle the fact that they'll have different styles and preferences and ways of communicating, ways of handling conflict and things like that. So the magic is being able to sort of sit at one level and say, right, in terms of like what is the important thing that this unit or this group of people do, let's set some goals, let's think of how to handle for complexity in the work, and trying to like finish stuff so that it's done and we're not having to like deal with lots of different complex problems all at the same time. Let's like simplify out the goals that we want, and let's work on them really focusedly together and get it done, and then sense and respond, like go and launch a really basic version of a product instead of the fancy version, and then see if the customer likes the basic version, and then if they like that, great, keep going and iterate and iterate and iterate. So there's definitely like a sense-making complexity angle to that. So as a team, you want them to like probe, do something, see what happens, probe the environment, see what happens. And then in order to...
Space and time. I mean, those are big themes for me, having studied hippocampus and a lot of this either-or stuff, subject-object stuff. I tried to study in terms of like trying to find common principles for space and thought, or space and memory. You know, there's a lot of that. So when you're talking, I'm thinking about how you are dealing with space and time, and how that is not distinct from what we were just talking about in terms of all those pressures of individual and team. It's interesting, that negotiation of if you change the constraints of time and space, I don't know, you set like, here's the task and here's the time and here's the contributions that each person thinks they can give them. The pressures around those subjects we were talking about change. Or is that what you were saying, or that's what it felt like?
Say more about how space fits into it. I think time I understand, because it's like, hey, we're going to like see if we can get this done by the end of the week and just try something like really small together. How does space fit into that?
I guess I was thinking about the way we were comparing it to sort of a landscape or something. I was thinking of space in terms of knowledge space, or not only physical space, but here's the knowledge space. Like we've marked out what the landscape is, so we know where we're starting from. We're not trying to solve every problem in all this huge landscape. Here's the little spot that we're going to look at right now. You know, it's kind of like mapping out the conceptual space or the idea space. I mean, I didn't mean necessarily geographical, but in my work, that's what I was trying to kind of say. I think it applies. You have this conceptual space or idea space, and if all the team members are aware, okay, here's the space we're looking at. There's all this other space too, maybe we get to, but we're going to focus here, and here's the kind of time constraint which we can handle. that changes the orientation of all those pressures of individual, team in an interesting way, or it seems like it could. I don't know.
Yeah, so there's one of the frameworks that's very popular is something called Scrum, which is it's basically playing with that as you have a team that has all the people that do the vast majority of the work sort of working in one team together. Normally this would be some sort of, like in the software world, that's often a cross-functional team that can do all the design, all the development, all of the testing, everything from end to end and get something done. And you say, right, we're going to break down time into specific chunks, and we're going to call each one a sprint, like 1 or 2 weeks or something like that. And we're going to go on a regular sort of cycle, and at the end of each of these cycles we expect to have something that is like done and is a meaningful step forward in our knowledge space together. So that is either like learning something about the user, or like finishing some bit of software and having it launched, or just doing something that increments us forward one bit at a time. Yeah, and by constraining it, then you ask the team, like, what do you all think that you can do, and do you all have something to contribute to that? And then the question of like people's individual performance or whatever is kind of subservient to like, or it should be subservient to, is the team achieving their collective goal? And you see the overall sort of product as being a set of like teams doing useful stuff together. So you have quite like long-lasting, often multi-skilled, multidisciplinary teams made up of very different types of people who will problem solve, and they'll each bring their own stuff into it. And when it works well, it works beautifully, because you don't need to worry about like, what are you doing today? Like, what do I care? Like, as long as you're in the team and the teams know what they're doing and everything sounds good, then like as a manager, sweet. Where it doesn't work is where someone isn't performing very well, and it's hard to know, and it's like you don't want to like ruin the party and switch off the music by asking like, right, is everyone here good at their jobs?
Yeah.
That's one for another time.
That's interesting for me, because thinking philosophically, right? Philosophy is a way of life or something, and thinking of it, trying to understand thinking, memory in connection with body, space, these kind of mental, physical things that I was bringing up that are big projects in philosophy, but I think relate to everyday life, because as I'm trying to understand how we can talk about that as individuals in all these different spaces, whether they're geographical or everyday life, or these concept knowledge spaces, or these spaces at work. We each have a very unique path, right? Since the beginning of our life to now, we've entered and been in those landscapes in a different way. So in the team, each individual is going to have a different path that got them to that place, which means they've seen different things, they have different skills, they're literally seeing that shared space differently. And that's an asset, because they're going to be seeing something that no one else is seeing. And everyone's going to be seeing something that no one else is seeing. And everyone's probably going to have some agility, some skill that's going to be more natural to them than everyone else. So you have this kind of beautiful setup, but the communication of how to figure that out, right? How do you figure out what's unique about my view that you don't see? That communication is so, that's the challenge, I guess, that how do you, it's providing a way to allow people to recognize that for themselves and share it with one another in the most efficient way possible. And like you were saying, if that hits, it's like what we were talking about. It's like flow. Right? It's like the sports team where everything's working. And if it doesn't hit, well, we know what that's like too. But isn't that weird? That what is that space? How do we create the conditions such that space emerges?
Yeah, it's really tricky, and like it can be done. It's like and there's all these other disciplines that contribute to it. I think when my work is done well, sometimes, rarely, occasionally by me, but most often by other people, you bring in ideas from family therapy and from sort of systems dynamics type things there, where you're thinking about like the unit here that we're interested in is like the family or the dynamics rather than like any individual person. And like there's tools you can bring out there and take to your team. There's ideas in like, how do you facilitate conversations in ways that allow people to more easily participate and to share what they have, and to make it sort of easy and low energy for them to like have a dumb idea, and everyone goes like, yeah, we could try that for a bit, and then we think about it and we go, that was dumb, and everyone goes like, great, okay, let's move on to the next one, like, good work. Often if we show up to work like fearful and worried about what my boss is going to think about me, about what my co-workers think about me, I'll be much more guarded, and I'll be much less likely to like give the insight that might be the thing that really moves us forward. And I'm kind of interested in like we're all doing this in our own minds as well, right? Like we have different parts of ourselves and different parts that are in dialogue or in I don't know, some sort of interplay within our own selves.
Well, that scaling that we were talking about is also within ourselves.
So like how, so I come to work as like a team of people in Daniel's body, and then I meet all the other team of people in everyone else's bodies, and then we meet the other teams of the other teams. And at some point, like, yeah.
Well, I guess in a really literal sense, I mean, we're cells that make up tissues and make up organs and make up, I mean, you can, I guess we have to think about, that's just the way we try to understand it, by separating it into all these parts. And so in these knowledge spaces of what is Daniel, or personality space, you're not really literally a lot of different parts, but it's where you're going to put your attention on, you're going to align differently to yourself in the same way that these other spaces align differently if we're going to look at the cellular level or whatever. So yeah, I think we do have that within ourselves, that we do see situations in ways that almost seem contradictory to ourselves when those situations are very different. A lot of it, I guess, philosophically, or trying to think of the study of mind and cognitive science and all these technologies that we build towards doing this, is trying to figure out a way to understand that process of how we do that as a body and within other assemblies of bodies, which are sort of teams. Like how does that process work? And some of it is just putting our attention on that process and being able to understand it as something we can study. I think that can be very, very helpful, and is probably behind a lot of these methods that we've been talking about, both in my work and your work, because then you can start to see what calibrates best or not. I don't know if you've ever looked at sports, because a lot of these analogies come from sports too. And I know there's a lot of science studying sports, or even, affordances in Gibson in sports. I don't know if that applies to any of these kinds of issues. It just comes to mind because we keep talking about teams, and I was talking about sports in my childhood and stuff. There's not a lot of philosophy taken from that, but
well, I'd be interested to hear about Gibson and sports and sort of where affordances show up for that. Is there a particular
It's actually a big field that has been studying Gibson for a long time. I'm not an expert on that because it's ecological psychology and it's sports.
Who's Gibson? Affordances, ecological psychology. What is?
Yeah, well, that would be a whole podcast in itself because it's really interesting. So I suggest people, if you're interested in this idea of affordance, which is basically opportunities for behavior. So as I was saying, we each have our own unique path of development, and that means that we've also developed a unique interactional relationship with the world around us, depending on everything that's been said to us, everything we've read, but also just our bodies. We all have different bodies and different sort of skills, and all of those opportunities for behavior, both in the geographical, everyday, physical so-called space, but also in these knowledge spaces we've been talking about. We have different opportunities for behavior than one another because we have a different development. Most of them are overlapping. A cup and the handle on the cup is pretty much the same for most of us. But maybe we've both read 10 of the same books, and you've read 2 books I haven't read, and I've read 2 books you haven't read. And so those little different ideas might come out differently when we're in a situation. And those would be affordances, epistemological or epistemic affordances that are a little bit different because our interaction with whatever the problem is will be just slightly different from one another. And that's kind of a beautiful bridge for us to collaborate and share. And then, in a weird way, you share your affordances with me, and then they become mine. And so that's kind of what affordances are. And that word is often connected to a man named J.J. Gibson, who was a psychologist, and it's called ecological psychology, which is a whole field which I won't try to explain, but it does have to do with this immediate interaction with the environment. He talks about vision a lot, but it's not only vision, but it's a kind of just to connect it to that mind-body thing. Instead of thinking there's a mind separate somewhere far away and then there's the body in interaction, it's as I'm a body interacting with my world, that is a kind of cognition. That is a kind of psychology immediately with our sensory systems. Thinking of it, that's very much a caricature, but just to connect it to all these other issues, it's about this immediacy of being in the world and interacting with the world, and how that is already itself a kind of cognitive act. We can think of these interactions in that knowledge space in the same way we might just with our bodies and what we can do with our bodies.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that. It's almost like there's an amount of cognition that's happening like out the box, even if just by like this sack of wetness, that's a horrible way of describing a body, being here in this moment, like there's already some cognition going on just by the way I'm structured.
Yeah, just to think of it as continuous, it's happening right now in your body, and that's continuous with whatever thoughts you feel like you're having sort of interior. It's not, these things are always going in both directions. It's hard to think about that. But yeah, it's not just some kind of internal you that's disconnected from your embodied interaction with the world. Both are always influencing one another. And sometimes the way you can notice that is through how you interact with these opportunities for behavior. You can put your attention on those affordances, those opportunities for behavior, and then you kind of learn something about one or other of those spaces, or there's actually many spaces, but the internal Daniel spaces, or the more social, external, so to speak, spaces.
Yeah. And like the alternative to that is thinking that like cognition is something that happens when I sit down and like do maths or something. It's like I sit and I close my eyes and I think, and some cognition happens or something.
Yeah, nobody can see it, and it's like tucked away inside your brain or something.
Yeah, whereas there being a kind of cognition that is like sitting on this chair with this chair that is well adapted for me to sit on it, and this bum that is well adapted to sit on a chair. That's a kind of like seated embodied cognition and something like that. And I don't have to like have any particular computationally complex model to describe that. It's just like it's there.
Or you can. Yeah, I think the tricky thing here is when people hear cognition, they already think of this experience we have of hearing our own thoughts or kind of remembering, which seems like, and this is almost reversing that. It's almost, you get to that point because you've attached words and images and so on, but that process, that movement, is very much an embodied movement that starts when you're born and the way that you interact with the world. So as you're learning words and people are talking to you, you're moving through the world. These aren't separate things. We tend to think of them like I develop my language and my cognition, my thinking, and then I was also learning how to walk and all of this. But actually, it's all happening at the same time as a continuous process. It's really hard to hold all that together because we come into awareness of ourselves through language and this thought that feels like it's so internal. But a lot of the research that's being done, for example, with memory and space and the brain and the body, is trying to kind of hold that paradox or move beyond that dichotomy and understand that this is an ongoing process at lots of different scales and layers, and they don't separate. You don't have over here the inner world and over here the external world. What you have is this ongoing layered constellation of processes that are always influencing one another. And that's very hard to talk about, but it's why we've developed things like complex systems, network theory, because it starts to give us a way to model it, to think about it. And it applies very much to what we've been talking about in terms of individuals and teams, because it's a similar sort of process that's happening there.
Yeah, there's this, I've heard it mentioned a few times. I'm not sure by who by. But mind being a process rather than an entity or something like that.
Yeah, process philosophy is a big thing, like Whitehead, for example, or Mark Burkhardt. Maybe you've come across him. He's in cognitive science. Or there's a lot of different ways of approaching it, of that for as long as people have been trying to understand the mind, they've been trying to do this. You mentioned Taoism earlier. In a way, that's, the yin-yang symbol where you have a little bit of the white and the black and the black and the white is kind of a visual representation of that same idea of you never have the external without the internal or the internal without the external. So, we've been trying to figure it out for a long time. I think it's almost more of a practice. It's more of trying to learn how to be in the world in a way that allows you to hold yourself as a cohesive, real, meaningful individual that's not bounded and that can still change and grow, and to hold everyone else around you like that, and to realize you're part of these larger groups, you're part of a planet, and those are bodies in the same sense that we were talking about earlier. Those are big, big challenges to really understand them, and we do it in our business, we do it in philosophy, we do it in science, and We all try to help each other. Yeah.
And we inherit all these starting points as well, which is like, if you're trying to think about mind as a process, well, like, we can't help but start with Descartes or start with whatever cultural inheritors for what a mind means to me. Those things are present, and even if I think I'm aware of them, I still don't realize the ways in which they constrain the sorts of questions I can ask and things like that. So I don't know. I know that when I try to talk to people about the idea of like a team being a mind in the same way that like a person is a mind, like it's just a bigger one, it consists of more bodies. It's almost impossible or it's very hard to get people out of thinking, yeah, like it's a mind, it's lots of different people together, all in their own minds, and it's an assemblage. And it's like, no, it is lots of minds together as well, but it also like has its own like supra macro cognition sort of quality to it. And what would happen if we treated a mind like we treated a team like another team member or something? And there's this person that shows up at work called the yellow team, or something like that. Yeah. And it's hard to break out of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to figure out how everyone uses the terms because we are assuming a certain thing. So when you say it's a group mind, some people might be thinking of that as like group think or something, as if you're having your agency taken away by the group, which is not what you're saying, even though there is some kind of sublation that's going on there. But we know this too. I mean, that's what happens when you go to a sports game. You become part of the crowd and you feel it. It doesn't mean you aren't also still an individual. Or when you're on the street in a big crowd and you can't not go the way of the crowd at some point. Like, we understand it, but I think sometimes it seems like it's either that or we're an individual. But it's always it's always both of those. And yeah, that can be the tricky thing, I guess, to explain or try and understand. For me, I'm literally trying to start with our movement in the world, the ways we make through the world. For me, that's already cognition. But I don't mean cognition in the way of having thoughts in your head. So for me, that's the trickiness, right? It's almost like the reverse of what you were just describing. I'm trying to get people to understand that this is an ongoing physical process that has developed into what we now think of as thinking. But as soon as I say cognition or thinking, people are in their heads. And that's the opposite of what I mean by the embodied action. So yeah, it's spiraling.
So is this part of your philosophy of waymaking and navigability that you were referring to? And just wondering if you could share a little bit of a primer on where you're up to with that.
Yeah, it's really just a practice or an orientation that I just sort of am highlighting a lot of these common patterns across many different other ways of doing science or doing philosophy that helps us understand that we are embodied in the world and that from day one, we are developing what we think of now as mind. And it's not something that we develop separate from our physical embodied interactions, but nested within it, so to speak. So when you have something like a mental problem, it's as real as any kind of a physical problem. It's just harder to really locate and understand the habits and the patterns that have caused that. But they're actually just as physical. I mean, they might be happening at different levels in your cellular makeup, but it's all continuous with the way you've made through the world in all these different spaces, in the geographical space, in the mental space, the social space, your emotional space. So it can just be kind of helpful, I think, to think of it as you are a unique body in the world and you've been in all these multiple spaces. And maybe sometimes you want to think about, how have I had to navigate my emotional space over time, and what affordances, what patterns have I developed in that emotional space that I don't recognize because they seem as if they've just always been there, because that's how it is when you walk a path. It seems like it's always been there. And you can start to realize your own path and what affordances have been given to you. What is the world? What sort of barriers, obstacles, streets, ways have been made for you in those different landscapes. It can be helpful to think of it like that, just as an exercise, and understand that your path is different from the paths of others, and then you might be able to increase how you connect with these other paths. Yeah.
So if I didn't have that philosophy available to me, like what kind of behaviors might I don't know if this is the right question even, but like, if I didn't think of myself as an embodied being that makes way in a physical world, and that idea of space sort of showing up in a relevant or an important way, I don't know, what kind of like things maybe mistakes would I make, or what kind of traps might I fall into, or something like that.
I think waymaking is just another name for being in the world. It's not a philosophy. It's just to understand that, because you can use it in all these different spaces. We make way in knowledge space, we make way in social space, but it's just a term because, yeah, it's just for making way through life. And I think what happens is if we're not aware that we've been on certain paths, that we've been moving through certain regularities that life has presented us with, and we've done our best with these affordances, and we've developed habits. If we don't recognize that that's what we've been doing, it feels out of our control. And to some extent it has been, because we're born as little children that need the world to take care of us, and it either does or doesn't. But I think it can be helpful not to feel stuck in a binary, to think, oh, this is a mental problem that's developed in my head and it's my fault. And no, actually, it's the same as your path through physical space. You've developed it that way, and it's been as much in your control as that has been, which is, for most of us, not so much until we get older. And you need help changing it, just like if you want to change stuff in your physical world. So I think it opens up the space. I think, and it's not only through something like navigability. You can think of a lot of the other things we've mentioned already. Process philosophy, different forms of religious practice are also trying to do this meditative practice where you just become aware that the space is wider than you think. You're not stuck in a binary that's called mental. That's just a term that we've given to something very real, but that is also a space through experience that can be traced and understood. And in so doing, you develop new ways to navigate, the same way you might if you were going to go explore a landscape. So I think what it gives you is just a way to open up the sense of responsibility, to feel a part of the ecology and the environment that you're in, to be able to look at what's been afforded to you, what's been given to you or taken away from you, because affordance is not a positive word only. It's also all the constraints and things you didn't have. Those are affordances too in this Gibsonian way of thinking. So yeah, I just think it helps you to start to think of your mental space as a space that you can look at in that way. And I found that helpful, and I find a lot of thinking of philosophy as a way of life in that sense can be very helpful, because then you start to look for which paths connect most to me. You talked about something like this at the beginning of I don't even remember the word you used, but wherever we are in our space, there's going to be certain paths more open to us or less open to us. And once you start thinking of your mental space, your emotional space in that way, you can maybe start to understand what's available to you and what would you like to connect more with, and what could help you get there, right? Maybe you don't need to jump all the way across into a completely different landscape, but maybe there's a route that's starting to open for you. Maybe it's religion, maybe it's a book you're going to read, maybe it's a certain business practice that's going to help, but it just opens that space, gives you more responsibility and less responsibility at the same time.
Yeah, I like that as well, because it may be in the physical world there are places that I want to go, but like I can't cut down all the brambles to get there. And there may be another path that's available to somewhere else that's nicer, or another way up to that same place that isn't through the brambles and that kind of thing. And it may be that in my like mental or emotional or spiritual space, there's ways that I'd want to be in the world, and like for whatever reasons those ways are just like mired in brambles, and maybe they're going to be available one day or with a certain set of tools, or maybe I need to find another path to that same place, or maybe I need to like look at a path that's easier to travel, that I won't get hurt as easily because I'm constrained in ways that I don't realize from going on the initial journey that I wanted to.
Exactly. And maybe you have a friend who's standing on the mountain and can see the landscape differently than you and can say, hey, don't go down that path, they've blocked the road, or also the weather is changing every day, and this is a dynamic landscape. It's the same in our conceptual emotional world. Those landscapes are dynamic too, so they're also not static. And yeah, we always need to be kind of helping one another, but also adjusting what we think we know, because the world around us is also adjusting, and that's true in the conceptual space just as it is in the physical space. So yeah, I like what you said.
It reminds me of some of the extended mind ideas of like scaffolding and the ways in which our culture will, or our cultures are full of ideas and practices and norms and things like that will have physical manifestations as well, but often a lot of like culture takes place in people's heads or without any like physical manifestations or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those norms become just as much obstacles or enablers as a physical barrier or something.
Yeah, those sort of scaffoldings or paths or whatever, they seem like the only paths there are because that's where the most people have walked, and they literally do scaffold or script, or there's a lot of different terms in neuroscience, cognitive science, that basically it's like the regularities of our habits. But once we notice them, especially collectively, I mean, in a business or a group or as a whatever kind of social group we are, once we notice them, then we've gotten to a different place of agency because we start to understand that we've created them or we've been following them. And that is a very kind of dynamic process towards, reimagining what's possible and what we want to be possible. And, these bigger questions that are at the heart of a lot of our work.
I think when it comes to like teams and organizations, what constrains those teams and what paths are available, like so many of those are from these things that they may not even think of as cultural, but I don't know how like bureaucratic or how hierarchical an organization is a sort of inherited scaffolding of like, how do you get by in this place? And like that can be helpful and it can be unhelpful. It like opens up some paths and it closes down others. And people, you sort of don't really realize that when you're in it. You just think that's the norm and that's how things are. And then sort of you may go to another place and be like, whoa, things are super different around here. And I guess seeing those elements as if they were a different physical space that's structured in a different way and with different stairs and ladders and slides to other physical locations might allow like mature organizations or mature teams to really be able to work out like, right, given these constraints or these paths in our waymaking, like how can we do what we need to do here?
Yeah, and not thinking that there's only one right way. Through any landscape, there's going to be a lot of paths that are going to get you to wherever you want to go. Also, wherever you're going to go is going to be changing as you're trying to get there. I think that's kind of an important thing when we're doing a project, understanding that the goal is also changing, or what we think of as the goal. So there's a kind of flexibility when you start to understand that these landscapes or these spaces of team projects are alive, dynamic, changing in a similar way to the physical spaces. There's regularity, so they're all changing together, and it's often happening in a regular and slow way, but they're living. These are living spaces, these knowledge spaces and these team spaces, and we don't need to be constrictive necessarily about our role and our definition and our goal. Those regularities need to be very clear, and they probably won't shift that much, but being allowed to shift is so important. This in all kinds of fields. I mean, if you're a teacher or a doctor, this is true too, because no one patient is going to be like the other one. And if you have to do exactly the same thing in every situation with every student and every patient, that's kind of a recipe for failure. So I think there's something about understanding that these social spaces, these scientific spaces are very much like physical spaces is helpful too, because you take each one as it comes, and you also apply what you've learned from the past in terms of what's similar to those situations, but you can do it in an agile way and a flexible way, rather than just following a formula that's supposed to work and playing a role that's supposed to work. You can mix the roles a little bit, or understand you're playing a role, first of all, which is important. So those kind of things.
Yeah, and these true in our lives in general as well, right? Which is like sometimes there's a formula that's worked for me like 100 times, and I try it on the 101st time and I didn't realize that like, no, the formula actually didn't work there. And sort of the judicious application of past experience is like what makes up wisdom or something. It's like knowing the difference is hard to do,
and staying,
you have to do by experience.
Yes, and staying motivated and present. I mean, when I lived in New York, I walked down the same street so many times that I almost stopped seeing it, so something new would maybe pop up and maybe I don't see it because I just see what I've been seeing for so long. I think we've all had that realization where you suddenly see something and it's maybe been there for weeks, but you just hadn't noticed it because you're just seeing what you think you normally see. We do that too in our conceptual and knowledge spaces, where we think we found the winning formula, And we don't realize that the environment around us has been changing, so that winning formula is probably not going to apply to it anymore, and we keep trying to apply it. So it's also about keeping yourself engaged and awake and noticing that you're part of an interaction, that it's not... We use the model and the math and the data and all of this to help us do that, but we're not actually living in that.
So yeah, so maybe we'll use this as a chance to bring the conversation to an end. Where can my audience find out more about you and about your work?
You can look at the research channel, which is Love and Philosophy. I guess the YouTube is probably where it's most popular or whatever. It's Love and Philosophy or Andrea Hiott, Hiott. And then there's a lot of writing, and I have a Substack, one which is more philosophical sort of writing, and one which is just Love and Philosophy. So you get the podcast, which is just conversations and writings about this. And then, there are books and stuff, but those are different subjects, and some philosophical and some about cars, for example. So if you like the Beetle.
That was the other thing I wanted to ask about the Beetle. Do we have a minute to talk about the Beetle?
Yeah, sure. It's actually about the same themes, because I was studying Hegel, and I could not believe that this car had started in Nazi Germany, and I only knew it as the Summer of Love car, like the car of love. And I was just so innocent. I mean, I was really young when I realized it, but I realized that this same car had started in this very strange place and ended up in my life being the love bug. And so I was very interested in how that had happened. So I ended up researching it. But it's a very philosophical book about the Volkswagen Beetle. But it's also just a story about the car. I do love the car for its journey into love out of very difficult, challenging times. Yeah, and
that's something we need at the moment,
Yeah.
given the state of the world in many different ways.
There's a lot of themes in there that are very similar. Yeah, finding new ways, learning from old ways. It's important, and connecting and understanding what's really meaningful, and forgiving each other, and these kinds of themes.
Andrea, thank you very much for coming on the Intelligent Teams podcast.
Thank you, Daniel. It was really fun to talk to you, and good luck with all your work.
Thank you.